very much, Ambassador Kanta. Today I'm speaking in my capacity as a Senior Research Associate at the Overseas Development Institute in London, which I have been for some years. Let me try to make 4 points on the economic side, which I think is a crucial leg of what you were saying. The security leg is the other, of course. The first point is about Sri Lanka's strategic location and economic geography. Much has been said by many people, including Admiral Columbage, about Sri Lanka's strategic location in the Indian Ocean along this main east-west trade route and the close proximity to India, which is rapidly growing. The big question for me is, has the benefit of this strategic location been realized? Now, to kind of draw some insight, we might look at modern theories of economic geography, a la Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize, and Anthony Venables, and they provide some very interesting insights on this question by suggesting that geographical considerations affect the volume of trade between places. This is closely linked to the notion about the location of production, industrial clustering, and supply chains. But of course, in the India-Sri Lanka case, gravity modeling exercises through econometrics suggest that the bilateral trade volume between India and Sri Lanka is much short of what could be the predictions of theories of economic geography. An added complication is really this large bilateral trade deficit in favor of India. Now, this is clearly a puzzle which really needs fresh attention by think tanks and researchers in both India and Sri Lanka. Given that India and Sri Lanka are only separated by, 20 odd kilometers at the closest point, it's a real puzzle, and one has to look at this in a very careful and surgical manner using economic and business analysis. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is really about promoting the supply chain trade, which you mentioned, and part of the answer really for the limited and uneven bilateral Sri Lanka-India trade. The point I wanted to mention was the spread of supply chain trade. And I was really saying that with the exception of India, supply chain trade is generally absent in South Asia. And we are at this new world order where a major opportunity for strengthening India-Sri Lanka links in this area, it really is the fact that supply chains are shifting out of China. And this really started before the pandemic due to rising wages in China, but also the trade war between the United States and China. And I think the pandemic could hasten this spread of supply chains to the rest of Asia. And India and Sri Lanka had this chance to exploit this. Another opportunity really is promoting two-way foreign investment flows between India and Sri Lanka. Now, we know about Indian investment in Sri Lanka. That has been there for many, many years. And there are many large companies here, from Tata to the TVS Group to many others, Hindustan Lever and others. The story which is under the radar is the Sri Lankan side of this, going to India. Sri Lankan firms have been present in small volume in the food industry and in the textile industries in the 5 South Indian states. And I think that is something that could be much more to the forefront, particularly from the Sri Lankan side, but with some support from India at state level is needed. On the side of Indian investors, the unexploited opportunity really is the services sector. The Sri Lankan economy is heavily oriented towards services. Some 60% of Sri Lanka's GDP is in services. And the Colombo Port City Special Economic Zone, which is kind of upcoming, may account for something as much as 10% of Sri Lanka's GDP. If you take, what benefits may arise, could be very attractive to Indian investors in services. I'm talking not just about IT, but financial services, professional services, and also creative industries such as filmmaking, cultural aspects, and so on. And it potentially could be a magnet for Indian investors in places like Gurgaon and Bangalore, worrying about high costs there and also the pandemic. So that's an important area. Now, this is not going to happen automatically. Both India and Sri Lanka need to take a number of steps to promote FDI bilaterally. Better targeting of investors is needed. Opening up of entry regulations is needed, and significantly reducing red tape through digitization. The third point is about the FTA, which was talked about. Now, East Asia's experience suggests that comprehensive bilateral FTAs with key trading partners result in more trade creation than trade diversion, and also really reduce the barriers to the spread of these supply chains. The story of the India-Sri Lanka FTA story is really quite long, isn't it? It goes back to 1998. And while goods trade has opened up with many exclusions, I was kind of surprised and pleasantly surprised to find that the use of the India-Sri Lankan FTA is quite high on the Sri Lankan side, meaning that Sri Lankan exporters are using those preferences to export to India. It's something like 70–80%, I noticed quite recently, and that's really quite encouraging. So this criticism that the India-Sri Lanka FTA is not used at all, at least from the Sri Lankan side, is simply not true. Now, to enable more gains from such an FTA, India and Sri Lanka should prioritize resuscitating this FTA discussion with a view to concluding an ambitious FTA, I believe, covering goods, services and investment. I think by the end of 2022 would be something realistic. Now, there are a couple of points that are needed to actually get this done. The first is we've got to have a template for a good quality FTA. And the best template really is the India-Sri Lanka FTA. For that India-Sri Lanka FTA is the Sri Lanka-Singapore FTA, which is the most comprehensive FTA in the South Asian context. And that can be a kind of a vision which could be arrived at beyond 2022 through a built-in agenda, as trade people would talk about it. But we should very much go beyond goods into these other areas. The second point is India has to take a deep look at this, and it should at least provide to Sri Lanka what it has given Bangladesh in terms of trade concessions. And I would argue that India should give Sri Lanka everything but arms access to the Indian market. Now, this might sound very ambitious to Indian commentators, but I think this is the kind of bold move that India really should make, because Sri Lankan business is not a threat to Indian business. India has a scale advantage, a scope advantage, and many other advantages that Sri Lankan business doesn't have. And so, to hear Indian business complaining about a few large Sri Lankan companies, and they're minuscule, by the way, by Indian standards, is quite extraordinary, I find, as a trade economist, come macroeconomist. The other point is that Sri Lanka, to make this FTA work, and one of the problems we've had is we have very weak trade negotiating capacity. So Sri Lanka should significantly invest in our trade negotiating capacity if we want to negotiate with Indians. And Indians have a reputation for being very tough trade negotiators, and we have been hopelessly outclassed in the past. And I think we really need to do this very strategically and carefully, and also step up our marketing of our exports to India, particularly at the states. And I think the South Asian Indian states would make a major step. The last point I want to make, Chair, is really about India's vaccine diplomacy and bilateral aid program. And these two are very closely aligned. The game changer really for the normalization of life and business in South Asia really is a vaccine, which is some months away. And there are many competing efforts, mostly undertaken by scientists in advanced countries or multinationals. Now, the Oxford University vaccine being manufactured by AstraZeneca could be available through Q2 or Q3 in 2021. I was listening to a podcast by Professor Adrian Hill, who was talking about what was coming. He's head of the institute at Oxford, the Zena Institute, that's developing this in partnership. And particularly if the phase 3 trials are successful, the concern for us in Sri Lanka is when will this be available to us and on what terms? I mean, if it's $1,000 a vaccine, that's going to be very expensive indeed, So what is really needed is a cheap generic version of this Oxford University vaccine, mass produced by India's Pune's Serum Institute and distributed through Indian foreign aid to Sri Lanka and other South Asian countries. And, you may recall that India has had interesting success in the health sphere through its aid program. This 1990 emergency ambulance service, which India provided under a foreign aid program, was quite remarkable in terms of helping taking patients to the public health system, which I think Admiral and others talked about today, and has been very, very useful in the COVID context in getting people to hospitals and other primary care facilities. Now, in terms of upgrading this vaccine distribution program through Indian bilateral aid, would really significantly increase the impact of Indian foreign aid, and also provide Indian leadership, I think, and that is important in global health initiatives such as the Gavi COVAX initiative and WHO's own advisory work. And Indian efforts in this way, I believe it really gears up, bilaterally and globally could offer a very credible alternative to China's efforts at vaccine diplomacy, which has some credibility question around it, given that people feel that maybe the scientific nature of some of their trials may be questionable. Just like in Russia, one is not quite sure if Sri Lankans would like to take a Russian or Chinese vaccine over an Indian/Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. I think that would be really wonderful. So in conclusion, let me reiterate my 4 points. The first is that we need to really do some detailed and proper empirical research using the lens of economic geography to understand better how to leverage this strategic location of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean. We talk a lot about it, but I think we now need to walk the talk by doing the proper research. Second, I believe that India and Sri Lanka really should take policy steps to reap the benefits from supply chain trade in this new world order, particularly as this type of trade is leaving China and looking for other locations. Third, India and Sri Lanka should really resuscitate this bilateral FTA negotiation by trying to be comprehensive and try to do it within a defined timeline. And Sri Lanka really needs to invest in the trade policy capacity if we want to try to make this work. And the last point is really a plea really for India to step up its efforts at vaccine diplomacy and bilateral aid, thereby replicating the wonderful success of your 1990 ambulance program, which is a massive, massive gift to Sri Lanka. Thank you so much, Chair.